So I want to tell a story. It's not a story that's autobiographical, but it's a more ancient story, and I've told it with some of you present before. So forgive me if you've heard it before, but there are good reasons why certain stories are classics. So this is a story about two of the great early rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and their academies of learning. And according to the Talmud, Hillel and Shammai and their students were involved in a great halachic debate, a great debate about Jewish life and practice for 3 years. Each side arguing back and forth, trying to convince the other of the correctness of their side of the argument. And lo and behold, after 3 years of argumentation, a voice cries out from the heavens and says, "These and these are the words of the living God." These and these are the words of the living God. The rabbis who edit the story then go on to ask, but if that paradoxical truth is so, why is it that 9 out of 10 times the arguments brought forth by Hillel and his academy carry the day, and those brought forth by Shammai and his academy are considered the minority opinion and are recorded but don't become normative? And the answer is that Hillel and his students were kind and modest and would always begin with the argument of their opponents before beginning to articulate their own position on an issue. So for me, there are a few lessons that are important about that story. The first is that none of us, no one person or community or tradition, has hold of absolute truth. If we did, we would be God. But we don't. Truth with a capital T, in its fullness, is beyond any of us, and all of us. There is always more. There is always a margin. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that in the context of colliding narratives, or moments of argumentation, or debate, or struggle, we must strive to articulate the best possible position that we hold, that we think, feel, and believe, and to try and persuade others if that is what we think is the best course of action. Remember, the rabbis didn't adjourn from the argument after a day, a week, or a year. They continued to be involved in dialogue. It wasn't as if, at the end of a long day's work, they got together and sang Kumbaya. They debated on an ongoing basis. So that's the second piece. There will be times and places where our narratives will collide. And in that context, we must be kind and modest and try and understand and articulate, as I interpret that story, the best possible rendering of the narrative, story, argument, position of another person or group. And then we can agree to disagree, knowing that we feel strongly about whatever it is that we are debating or discussing, but also maintaining some theological or epistemological humility, which says, I may be wrong. That somewhere, even on issues that we care most deeply about, I may be wrong, or I may have something to learn from this other person, text, tradition, community. Or there may be ways in which I'm articulating this that are not yet refined enough. The last thing that I want to say is that in the context of the Talmud, this is a story that takes place within an exclusively Jewish Beit Midrash, a house of study. So, while the rabbis in this story might have never imagined that I would use it in an interfaith context, I do think that it's a powerful story for use not only within a single religious community, but in conversations, discussions, debates, argumentations that take place across religious lines. And that, in some way, all of these centuries later, that Hillel and Shammai, for me, still represent important models for conversation about things that matter most to us. oftentimes in the Talmud, a discussion which is very heated, but in which people are participating with genuineness and openness, is called an argument for the sake of heaven. Right? It is a machloket l'shem shamayim. And of those arguments, the rabbis say, they will continue. You might read that as a pessimistic statement, but the rabbis say, no, they're going to continue until the coming of the Messiah. Because that's the nature of human discourse.
If you would look at it in the other way and you flip the question and say, what would religion be like and what would the world be like if we wouldn't have these conflicts? It would be one-minded, like an echo chamber. We do need the other, because precisely the other is there to correct us, to teach us, to catch our refugees, from our own stories, who got hurt and ran over, and they find some other ways, some other narrative to be part of. If we would have only one narrative, that has been tried in the past. Religious people, they had a chance to impose narratives, and it wasn't a good thing. So that this conflict, that makloket, is wonderful, because we have a conflict not against one another, but we have a conflict for one another. We are both trying to create something better for each other and for us together and for myself. We both leave from the conversation better, and so those are the. It's a form of a blessing.